What's up, all you beautiful people? Welcome back to the podcast. So I have been head down over the last month and a half preparing next year's speech. I have a speaking tour will be going on. And every year I like to have one keynote that I use as I go from stage to stage to stage. And I take that and I morph it slightly for each audience, for each event. So it's slightly different, but the overall frame is effectively the same. And as I'm working on this and I'm in the workshop, scripting it and going through all the rehearsals and everything like that, it dawned on me that it's kind of a black box for a lot of people. A lot of people are interested in learning how to become a public speaker, how to give a keynote presentation, but there's not a lot of information out there from people who are like actually in the weeds doing the thing. And so I wanted to share with you some of the ideas that have served me really well as it comes to one, both crafting a compelling keynote and then how to actually technically deliver it, because that is where, really the rubber meets the road. So the very first thing is to not underestimate the amount of work and rehearsal that you need to put in if you want it to be an exceptional keynote. A good rule of thumb from the world of theater is what's called 2 for 1. So in the world of theater, for every 1 minute you have speaking a line, you should rehearse 2 hours. So if you had a 10-minute speech, a 10-minute presentation, then you should spend 20 hours rehearsing that. If you had a 1-hour speech, then you should spend 120 hours. Now, if you really think about that, that is a lot of time, right? When is the last time you spent 20 hours rehearsing a 10-minute presentation? That presentation might be, giving a end-of-year report to your team, or doing some kind of local event where you just stand up and talk for 10 minutes. 10 minutes doesn't seem like a very big deal, but 20 hours is a significant time investment. Can you imagine how much better you would be after 20 hours of work versus what most people do? Is most people, they'll write it out, they'll go through the bullet points in their head, and they'll practice it 3 or 4 times. And I know this because I've been on the speaking tour enough times now. I've talked to other speakers who are coming up in the ranks and they're trying to get to that next level. And I talked to them back in the green room. I'm like, what's your process for practicing this? And a lot of them will say, I go through it a couple of times. I feel really confident in the materials. And almost every single time I have this conversation with people, what ends up happening is they come back after seeing my presentation or one of the other, we'll say banner keynotes, the people who are like paid lots of money to come and give the presentation. They'll almost always come back and they're like, that was so much better. Like they feel the comparison between what they gave and what the professionals give. There's like this massive gap, and they're like, I think I need to practice more. And it's like, yeah, I think you do. Because what ends up happening is it's really easy to overvalue your own competence as a speaker, because you know your domain topic really well. And you're like, I could talk on this topic for an hour, no problem. But there's a difference between just talking about a thing for an hour and delivering an engaging and impactful presentation. They're very, very different things. And what ends up happening is most experts, they just go and babble. They just keep talking around and around and around, but it doesn't go anywhere. And so, yeah, you could fill an hour with speaking, but you didn't fill people with your words. They just kind of blocked out 92% of it. And you want to avoid that by actually putting in the work beforehand to make sure that your presentation is concise and precise. Now, number 2, to make it as precise and concise as possible, I script out my speeches word for word for word. Now, understand I'm better as a writer than I am a speaker, so that's how I formulate and process my thoughts and my words the best. You might not be like that, but I do believe there's still value for everybody to sit down and actually write out your speech word for word. Write out the punchlines, write out the beats, write out the pauses, all of that stuff. Because as you have it scripted out on the page, now as you start to rehearse it, you have the optimal frame. You have the optimal way to tell your story, to deliver the message. You've cut out all the fluff, because as you go through it, you're like, oh, I don't need this, I don't need that. This is actually a better word to use in this instance. That's very hard to do when you're just editing it and holding it all in your brain. So I like to script it all out. I don't like to bullet point. I like to actually script out the words. Now, though I script it out word for word and I practice it word for word, what I typically do is I break the speech into different blocks around different stories or different points. And the goal is to take those blocks and then shuffle them up and practice them out of order. because it's really easy to get just into your own head about, okay, I tell this story and I tell this story, then this story. And if you, for whatever reason, get off of your place in the speech, you can be really screwed up if you do that. So a lot of times when people practice word for word, they don't practice flipping the speech, doing it backwards, or doing this block and then that block completely out of order. And as a result, they only have one way they can actually tell the speech, which is front to back. And then inevitably you will get thrown. Like, I don't care how many times you practice, like I still get thrown every now and then. Something happens in the crowd, you go to engage with it rather than just sticking to the script. And if you do that and all you know how to do is like stick to the script, then it can be really hard to navigate back to where you were. So if you ever lose your place in a speech, which happens all the time, like the biggest speech I gave last year, I lost my place like around the 13-minute mark. Funny story actually of why that happened, and it's a perfect example of what I just described. Is when you practice your speech in one particular way all the time, then if anything is different from that way you practiced it, it can really throw you. So you want to practice in all sorts of different environments and all different types of ways. You want to do what I call the whisper shout, where you give the speech as a whisper and then you give it as a shout, and then sometimes you whisper this block and you shout that block, and you do cardio in between different blocks so you're out of breath, right? You're doing it in this environment, then you're doing it in that room, you're doing it as you're walking down the street. So you're doing it in all these different environments and all these different ways, because there will be uncontrollable elements in the keynote that you can't foresee. And you become very fragile if the only way you ever practice your speech is from front to back in this room, staring at that mirror in this particular monotone type of way, right? So you want to have as many different ways to tell it as possible. And what caught me out actually in that speech last year was a very simple thing. When I rehearsed, I would always start a stopwatch on my phone right next to me so that I could see exactly where my blocks were hitting on the clock. Because the true hallmark of a professional is they don't go too long, they don't go too short, they hit the exact amount of time they were given, right? That's how you make friends with event coordinators. So I practice with the stopwatch, and the stopwatch is ticking up. So, it goes 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, right? So as I'm spending more time, it's ticking up. And then when I get to the 40-minute mark, I'm like, oh, cool, this is where the speech wraps up. Well, when I got on stage, what I didn't expect is that the timer wouldn't be ticking up. It would actually be counting down. So that timer did not start from 0 and go to 40. It started at 40 and it ticked down to 0. And at around like the 13, 14-minute mark, I looked at the clock and I did a moment of mental math, because I saw on the clock it said something like, what would it have said? It probably said 27. And in my mind, I go, well, what does that mean? How much time does that mean I've used, right? And so in that simple moment of looking at a clock, doing mental math, I lost my place in the speech entirely. So the thing that saved me was one of these two next strategies I'm going to share with you. Number one is what I call the well actually story. The well actually story is when you're talking on one topic and you take a dramatic pause and you kind of almost extemporaneously go, you know what? Well, actually, I was going to tell you this, but let's put a pin in that. I want to ask you guys this. I want to tell you about this thing real quick. And the well actually story is a backup story that you only pull out when you've lost your place. And so when you feel that, you go, just pivot, just go, well, actually, let's put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to that. But I think you guys would get value out of this. Let me tell you this thing, right? And so now you pivot to your backup story. And usually what happens is about 5 seconds into your backup story, you go, oh yeah, I remember where I am now, right? So finish your backup story, then go back. Very, very simple. The second thing is instead of a well actually story, you can do a, hey, actually, can I ask you guys a question? Are you guys getting value out of this? Is this helpful? Are you enjoying this so far? Let me hear from you guys, right? So now you just stop. And instead of sitting there scratching your head being like, what do I do now? You ask them, hey, are you guys enjoying this? Is this bringing you value? In most speaking contexts, people will go, yeah, woo, yeah, you're doing great, right? People are supportive and you're probably crushing it up to this moment. So then here's the magic. After they're done cheering, you go, awesome, cool, just making sure. Where was I? And you just ask, where was I? And you let them tell you, hey, you were just telling us this thing. And usually when we lose our place, it's because we can't remember what we had just come off of. So when they go, oh, this and this, you're like, that's right. All right, bum, right? Now they've helped you get your place back. So those are two techniques I like to use, the well actually story. And hey, can I ask you guys a question? Last is, Wait, no, actually, I think as I'm looking at my list here, this is actually, let me ask you guys now. That's actually everything I had written down here. Yeah. So I think the big fear that a lot of people have when it comes to public speaking is losing their place. So those two techniques, very, very helpful. That plus the practicing and then taking everything out of blocks. You do that. If you even put in 1 hour of work for every 1 minute of speaking, so even if you're not going like 20 hours for a 10-minute speech, but instead just doing 10 hours, I think you will feel so much more comfortable and natural. And at the end of the day, that's the real goal of a keynote, is to deliver it in a way that it feels organic and it flows, that they don't feel like this is an overly rehearsed speech. And the only way that you can get to that place is by rehearsing it so many times that it becomes second nature. And then within that second nature, you can start to improvise and you can start to pull in the crowd engagement. If somebody makes a woo at a particular point, right, you can engage with them and people will feel like, oh, that was the best keynote I've ever heard, because that person just felt so locked in, like they were speaking to me. And the more that you can divorce your conscious mind from having to remember what you're talking about, and you can just trust in your body's memory, like the muscle memory, that you can just be present in the moment and enjoy it, I think you'll get a lot more out of it, and I think your audience will too. So those are some thoughts on how to deliver a kick-ass keynote. I hope you take that. I hope you go out and you crush. Send me recordings, send me links to your guys' speeches. I'd love to see it. And hopefully we can, if you see me at an event in 2025, come say hi. I'd love to see you guys. Otherwise, stay tuned. We will see you in the next episode.